I now pronounce you man and wife.
My name is Amarachi, and 3 years ago, I stood in a church and watched my husband exchange vows with my best friend. I was seated in the 3rd row. Nobody warned me. Nobody stopped it. And by the time I understood what was happening, the priest had already said, I now pronounce you man and wife. Stay with me till the end, because what I discovered 6 months later about why they did it will shake you. And if stories like this keep you glued to your screen, hit that subscribe button right now, because you don't want to miss what happens next. Let me take you back to where it all began. Because to understand how a woman ends up watching her own husband marry her best friend, you have to understand how deep the betrayal was buried before it ever surfaced. I met Kanayo when I was 23 years old, fresh out of university, working my first job at a small accounting firm in Enugu. He was tall, soft-spoken, the kind of man who opened doors and remembered your birthday without being reminded. We dated for 2 years before he proposed, and when he did it in front of my entire family, kneeling on the red soil of my father's compound with a ring he had saved 8 months to buy. I cried. My mother cried. Even my strict father, a retired school teacher who never showed emotion, wiped his eyes and pretended it was dust. My best friend, Ngozi, was there too. She had been my best friend since secondary school, since we were 15 years old, sharing 1 plate of rice during break time because neither of our families could afford much. We had grown up together, cried on each other's shoulders through heartbreaks, celebrated every small victory like it was our own. When I got the job at the accounting firm, she was the first person I called. When my father was hospitalized for typhoid, she was the one who sat with me in the waiting room until 2 a.m. So when I got engaged to Kanayo, there was no question. Ngozi would be my chief bridesmaid. She screamed with joy when I told her. She hugged me so tight I nearly lost my breath. She said, Ada, God has finally answered your prayers. I believed her. I believed every word. We got married in a beautiful ceremony in December, the kind of wedding people still talk about in our hometown. Live band, a soibi that matched perfectly, and a reception that lasted until midnight. Ngozi stood beside me the entire day, straightening my gele, wiping stray tears, whispering into my ear that I looked like a queen. If you had told me that day that in 4 years, this same woman would be walking down an aisle to marry my husband, I would have laughed in your face and called you mad. But betrayal doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come knocking with warning bells. It creeps in slowly, disguised as friendship, disguised as help, disguised as love. The first 2 years of my marriage were peaceful. Kanayo worked as a site manager for a construction company, and I continued at the accounting firm, eventually moving up to a senior position. We were building something, a small duplex on the outskirts of Enugu, savings accounts, dreams of children. Ngozi visited often. She had married a man named Ebuka a year after my wedding, but the marriage was troubled from the start. Ebuka drank heavily, and money seemed to slip through his fingers on schemes he never fully explained to her. She would come to our house sometimes just to breathe, just to sit in a home that felt like peace. I welcomed her every single time. I never once suspected that the peace she was breathing in my home was slowly turning into something else, something dangerous. Looking back now, there were signs. Small things I brushed off because I trusted both of them completely. Ngozi started coming around even when I wasn't home, telling me she needed to borrow something or drop off food she had cooked for Kanayo because, in her words, a man should not be eating outside food when his wife is busy at work. At the time, I thought, what a good friend, what a thoughtful woman. I never imagined that a woman who called herself my sister was slowly rearranging herself into my husband's daily life, one small gesture at a time. There was also a change in Kanayo that I noticed but couldn't name. He started working later. He started taking calls outside the house, stepping onto the balcony and lowering his voice when his phone rang. When I asked, he said it was work stress, a difficult project, a demanding boss. I believed him because why wouldn't I? We had built 4 years of trust, 4 years of a marriage that from the outside looked like something out of a storybook. And then, in our 3rd year of marriage, I lost a pregnancy.
I was 14 weeks along. We had already told our families. My mother had already started knitting tiny sweaters. And then one Tuesday morning, I woke up in a pool of blood and pain so sharp I could barely scream for help. Kanaya rushed me to the hospital, but by the time we arrived, it was already over. The doctor's words still echo in my head sometimes, late at night when the house is too quiet. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Kanayo, there's no heartbeat." I fell into a darkness I had never known before. For months, I could barely get out of bed. I stopped eating properly. I stopped going to work, taking a long leave that nearly cost me my job. And through it all, Ngozi was there. Every single day. She would come with soup, with prayers, with the kind of gentle patience that made me love her even more. She would sit with me for hours, saying nothing, just holding my hand while I stared at the ceiling. I thought God had blessed me with a friend like no other, a friend who loved me enough to watch me fall apart without judgment. But grief, I would later learn, is the perfect cover. Grief blinds you. Grief makes you grateful for company, any company, without asking too many questions about why that company is always so willing, so present. If this story is pulling you in the way I think it is, do me a favor, tap that subscribe button now, because what happened next is the part that changed everything, and I promise you, you did not see it coming. It took me almost a year to recover from the loss. Slowly, I found my footing again. I went back to work. I started smiling again, laughing again, even talking about trying for another baby. Kanayo seemed supportive through it all, patient, kind, or so I thought. But there was a distance growing between us that I mistook for the natural aftermath of grief. Couples drift after loss, I told myself. This is normal. This will pass. What I didn't know, what I could not have known, was that during those months, while my marriage to Ebuka's household chaos was pushing Ngozi to lean harder and harder on the comfort she found in my home, something was quietly shifting between her and my husband. It didn't happen all at once. It happened in stolen moments. A comforting hug that lasted too long. A phone call about how worried she was about me that turned into conversations about things that had nothing to do with me at all. A friendship built on genuine care that slowly, quietly poisoned itself into something else entirely. Almost 2 years after my miscarriage, Ngozi's marriage to Ebuka finally collapsed. It had been failing for a long time. Ebuka had lost a significant sum of money her own father had entrusted to the couple for a family-building project in a reckless investment he never told her about until the debt collectors came knocking. The shame and financial ruin pushed him deeper into drinking and eventually into the arms of another woman whom she caught in their marital bed. It was the final straw in a marriage already buckling under money troubles that had haunted her for over a year. Desperate and terrified of her father's fury, afraid of how it would look if her family discovered how badly the money had been lost, Ngozi confided in the one person she trusted completely outside her own family. Me, or so I believed. In truth, she confided in my husband. Kanayo, it turned out, had access to funds through his construction company, funds tied to a project he was overseeing that involved kickbacks from contractors, money he had begun quietly siphoning almost a year earlier for reasons that, at the time, had nothing to do with Ngozi at all. When she came to him in desperation after her divorce, seeing an opportunity to help her, and perhaps, if I'm honest, seeing an opportunity for himself, he offered to help her recover her losses through a land investment, using both the stolen construction funds and money quietly withdrawn from our joint account. In exchange, she would function as a business partner, And somewhere in the months of secret meetings and shared guilt that followed, business partner became something more. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I did. I sat with that truth for a long time after I discovered it, turning it over and over, trying to understand how two people who claimed to love me could build something ugly out of my pain. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because the discovery didn't come easily. It came in pieces, like a puzzle nobody wanted me to complete. The first crack appeared not long after Ngozi's divorce was finalized. I supported her through it, the way a good friend would. I let her stay with us for 2 weeks while she found her footing, never once suspecting that inviting her into my home during that vulnerable time was like inviting fire into a room full of dry wood. During those 2 weeks, something shifted. I noticed it but couldn't place it. The way conversations would stop abruptly when I walked into a room, the way Kanayo seemed usually attentive to Ngozi's emotional state, checking on her more than seemed necessary, offering to drive her to appointments I could have easily handled myself. I asked him about it once, half joking. "Are you falling for my best friend?" He laughed so hard, so naturally, that I felt ashamed for even asking. "Ada, don't be silly," he said, pulling me into his arms. "You are the only woman for me." I believed him. God forgive me, I believed him completely.
Ngozi eventually moved into her own apartment, but the visits didn't stop. If anything, they increased. She would come over on weekends when she knew I had church programs or work events that kept me away for hours. I only pieced this pattern together much later, when it was too late to matter. The second crack came a few months after that, when I started noticing small discrepancies in Kanayo's spending. As an accountant, numbers were my language, and something in our joint account didn't add up. Money was disappearing in amount too consistent to be careless spending, always around the same time each month, always just under an amount that would trigger questions from the bank. When I asked him about it, he told me it was for a business investment with a friend from work, something he was keeping quiet because he didn't want to jinx it before it paid off. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him, so I let it go. It was our help hand, a young woman named Blessing, who had worked for us for 2 years, who finally gave me the thread that unraveled everything. One evening, as I sat in the kitchen going over some documents, she hesitated by the doorway, wringing her hands the way people do when they are carrying something too heavy to hold alone. "Madam, can I tell you something? Please don't be angry with me." My stomach dropped before she even finished her sentence. I told her to speak. "Sometimes when you travel for work, Auntie Ngozi comes here, not just to visit. She stays the night, madam." The room seemed to tilt around me. I asked her to repeat herself, hoping I had misheard, hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something less devastating. But she said it again, and this time she added something that broke me completely. "I thought maybe you knew, madam. I thought maybe it was allowed." I did not sleep that night. I lay beside my husband, staring at the ceiling, feeling like a stranger in my own bed, replaying every late night, every hushed phone call, every knowing look I had brushed aside as nothing. The pieces were forming a picture I couldn't unsee. I didn't confront him immediately. Instead, I did what any accountant would do. I built my case. I checked phone records when I could. I watched patterns. I noted dates, times, the excuses that no longer made sense once I was actually looking for cracks in them. 3 weeks of quiet, methodical investigation, all while smiling at breakfast, all while pretending my heart wasn't shattering a little more each day. What I found didn't just confirm an affair. It confirmed something so much bigger than infidelity, something that would explain every strange decision that followed. And I promise you, this is where the story takes a turn you won't expect. So if you haven't already, subscribe now, because the next part is the twist that made me question everything I thought I knew about the 2 people I trusted most in this world. Buried in Kanayo's old emails, which I accessed using a password he had once shared with me during happier times, I found a document, a land document.
Not long after Ngozi's divorce, Kanayo quietly purchased a large plot of land in a rapidly developing part of Enugu, land that had, in the time since, tripled in value due to new government infrastructure projects nearby. This land was not in his name alone. It was jointly registered under two names, his and Ngozi's. I sat staring at that document for what felt like hours, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. This was the business investment he had told me about, the one he swore was with a friend from work. He hadn't lied about the friend. He had simply let me believe it was a man. I dug deeper, cross-referencing dates against his company's project timelines, and the full shape of it became horribly clear. Kanayo had been siphoning kickback money from contractors for close to a year before Ngozi's divorce even happened. Money that had nothing to do with her at first. A private theft he had been nursing quietly, perhaps out of his own restlessness, perhaps out of greed that had been growing long before any of this began. When Ngozi came to him broken and desperate after discovering how badly her father's money had been lost, he offered her a way out. She took it, and somewhere between the secrecy of managing stolen money together and the guilt of what they were building behind my back, comfort turned into something else. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Their affair, as devastating as it was, grew out of something that had already been rotting quietly for a year. My husband's theft, my best friend's desperation, and a shared secret that gave them a reason to keep finding each other in the dark. I confronted Kanayo on a Sunday evening after church when I knew he would be relaxed, unguarded. I laid the printed document on our dining table without a word. I watched the color drain from his face as he realized what I had found. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, instead of the apology I expected, instead of the shame I hoped might still exist somewhere in him, he did something that broke whatever last hope I had for our marriage. He got angry. He accused me of snooping, of not trusting him, of driving him toward Ngozi with what he called my coldness after the miscarriage. He said things that night I will never forget, that I had become a shell of a woman after losing the pregnancy, that I had stopped being a wife to him in every sense that mattered, that Ngozi had simply been there when I wasn't. He twisted the knife of my own grief and used it against me, as if my pain over losing our child was somehow the reason he chose to betray me with the money and the woman I trusted most. I asked him one question that night, the only question that truly mattered to me. Do you love her? He was silent for a long time before he answered. He said, I don't know. But we're too deep now. There's too much money involved. Too much history.
Too much money. Too much history, not too much love. Even in that moment of confrontation, he couldn't lie to me about loving her, only about the tangled mess of guilt, greed, and obligation that had trapped all three of us in this nightmare. I confronted Ngozi the next day, showing up unannounced at her apartment. I will never forget her face when she opened the door and saw me standing there, documents in hand. She didn't even try to deny it. Perhaps some part of her had been waiting for this moment, dreading it and craving it in equal measure, the release of finally being seen for who she truly was. She cried. She apologized. She told me it started with him helping her survive the collapse of her marriage, that gratitude turned into something neither of them expected, and somewhere along the way, comfort became something they couldn't stop. She told me about her father's fury when the family money was lost, about the shame that would have destroyed her if the full truth had come out, about how Kanayo's offer to help felt like a lifeline she couldn't refuse. I never meant to fall in love with him, she said, tears streaming down her face. I swear, Ada, I never meant for any of this to happen. But intentions, I have learned, mean nothing when the damage is already done. A knife doesn't ask forgiveness for cutting, simply because the hand that held it didn't mean to draw blood. I left her apartment that day with something I hadn't expected to find: clarity. For weeks, I had been drowning in grief and confusion, trying to understand how the two people I trusted most could betray me so completely. But standing in Ngozi's living room, watching her cry over a mess she had helped create, I realized something important. Their guilt was not my burden to carry. Their choices were not a reflection of my worth as a wife or a friend. I had done nothing wrong. I had simply trusted people who did not deserve that trust. I moved out of our house within the month, staying with my parents while I processed everything and began the legal proceedings for divorce. My father, the same man who had cried at my wedding, sat me down one evening and told me something I have carried with me ever since. Amarachi, some people will use your kindness as a doorway to your downfall. It does not mean you stop being kind. It means you learn to see clearly who deserves to walk through that door. The divorce proceedings took nearly a year. During that time, I also passed along what I had discovered about Kanayo's financial misconduct at his company. Information I shared not out of vengeance exactly, but because I believed the truth deserved to see daylight. An internal investigation was launched, and Kanayo was eventually let go from his position, though he managed to avoid criminal charges by agreeing to repay a significant portion of the stolen funds. The land he and Ngozi had purchased together had to be liquidated to cover these repayments, wiping out most of what they had gained from a year of quiet theft and deception. But here is the part of this story that I know you are waiting for, the part that brings us back to where I started, the wedding. Despite everything falling apart around them, despite losing money, reputation, and any semblance of dignity in our small community where news like this travels faster than wind, Kanayo and Ngozi decided to get married. I believe, looking back, it was partly genuine feeling that had grown between them over the months of secrecy, and partly a desperate attempt to justify everything they had destroyed. If they didn't marry, if they didn't build something lasting from the wreckage, then what had it all been for? What had my pain, my miscarriage, my broken trust all been sacrificed for, if not something they believed was real? They planned a small, quiet wedding, nothing like the celebration Kanayo and I had shared years earlier. Only close family and a handful of friends were invited. I was not on that list, obviously. Or so I believed. This is the story's final, most painful turn. 3 days before the wedding, I received a phone call from Ngozi's younger sister, Kelechi, a woman I had known since childhood, someone who had watched the entire saga unfold with quiet disapproval of her own sister's actions. She told me something that made my blood run cold. Ngozi had specifically requested that I be invited to the wedding. I couldn't understand it at first. Why would she want me there, the woman she had betrayed, the friend whose husband she had stolen? Kelechi explained, her voice heavy with reluctance, that Ngozi had been struggling with guilt for months, guilt she couldn't seem to shake despite everything. In some twisted way, Ngozi believed that if I attended the wedding, if I could somehow show up and witness it without falling apart, it would mean I had truly forgiven her, that our years of friendship weren't entirely erased by this one devastating chapter. But I was furious when I heard this, the audacity of it, the sheer selfishness of wanting my presence at the very ceremony that celebrated my deepest betrayal, also she could feel better about herself. I told Kelechi I would never attend, that the request itself was an insult layered on top of injury. But something changed in me over those 3 days. I thought about my father's words. I thought about the year of healing I had done, slowly rebuilding my sense of self after losing not just a marriage, but a lifelong friendship. I realized that if I stayed away, if I hid from this moment, some part of me would always feel like I was running from them, like they still held power over my emotions, my choices, my presence in spaces I had every right to occupy. So, I decided to go. Not for them, for me. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing an outfit that made me feel strong, powerful, untouchable. I did my makeup with steady hands, though my heart was pounding the entire time. I told myself I was walking into that church not as the betrayed wife, not as the wounded friend, but as a woman who had survived something ugly and come out the other side whole. I arrived just as the ceremony was beginning, slipping quietly into the 3rd row, close enough to see everything, far enough to maintain my composure. Heads turned when I walked in. Of course they did. Everyone in that room knew the history, knew the scandal that had rippled through our community for the past year. I felt every eye on me, but I kept my chin high, my expression calm. And then I watched. I watched Kanayo standing that morning, dressed in a suit similar to the one he had worn on our own wedding day, standing at the altar with an expression I couldn't quite read. Was it happiness? Guilt? Some complicated mixture of both. I watched Ngozi walk down the aisle in a white dress. Her father, the same man whose money had started this entire chain of events, walking beside her with a face that betrayed no joy, only quiet resignation. I want to tell you I felt nothing. I want to tell you I sat there, unmoved, a portrait of strength and indifference. But that would be a lie, and I promised myself when I started telling the story that I would tell it honestly. I felt everything. I felt the gust of my own wedding day, the memory of walking down a similar aisle 4 years earlier, believing I was building a future with a man who loved me, surrounded by a friend I trusted with my whole heart. I felt the loss of my unborn child rise up in my chest, unexpected and overwhelming. I felt anger, grief, and something strange and unexpected that I can only describe as release. Because sitting there, watching them exchange vows, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. This wasn't my ending, this was theirs. Whatever they were building on this foundation of betrayal and stolen money and broken trust, it belonged to them now, not to me. I had already survived the worst part. I had already done the hardest work of grieving, of rebuilding, of choosing myself over the wreckage they left behind. This ceremony, this small, quiet wedding with its subdued energy and its guilty faces, was simply the final chapter of a story I no longer belonged to. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, I did something that surprised everyone in that room, including myself. I stood up quietly and I walked toward the altar before anyone could stop me. Ngozi's face went pale. Kanayo's hands visibly trembled. The entire congregation held its breath, likely expecting a scene, expecting tears or accusations or some dramatic confrontation befitting the scandal that had brought us all to this moment. Instead, I simply looked at both of them and I said, I forgive you. Not because what you did was right, but because I refuse to carry the weight of your choices for one more day. I hope whatever you built together was worth everything it cost. Then I turned and I walked out of that church, out into the bright afternoon sunlight, and I did not look back. I want to pause here because I know some of you are wondering what happened after that, whether their marriage survived, whether guilt eventually caught up with them the way it so often does. And I promise we're getting there. But first, if this story has moved you even a little bit, make sure you're subscribed because the way things unfolded after that wedding day is a lesson in itself about the true cost of betrayal. In the 2 years since that wedding, I have watched from a respectful distance as karma has had its own quiet way of settling accounts. Kanayo struggled to find stable employment after the scandal at his construction company became public knowledge within our industry circles. Word travels fast among professionals, and few companies wanted to take a risk on a man known for financial misconduct. Ngozi's relationship with her father never fully recovered from the discovery of how his money had ultimately been entangled in all of this, and family gatherings that once brought them together became strained, infrequent affairs filled with unspoken tension. I heard about a year after their wedding that Ngozi struggled with severe anxiety, unable to shake the guilt of what she had done to a friendship she once valued deeply. I heard that Kanayo, stripped of the career he had built and the reputation he once carried with pride, became a quieter, more withdrawn version of the confident man I had married. Neither of them, from what I understand, found the happiness they perhaps believed would justify everything they destroyed to be together.
I share this not with satisfaction or vindictiveness, though I won't pretend there wasn't some small part of me that felt a sense of justice in learning these things. I share it because it taught me something important about the nature of betrayal and the foundations we choose to build our lives upon. When you construct something, a relationship, a marriage, a friendship, on lies, on stolen resources, on the broken trust of someone who loved you, that foundation will always be unstable. No amount of genuine feeling that might exist between two people can fully compensate for the weight of how that connection began. As for me, my life took a path I never could have predicted on that painful day when I first learned the truth. The financial expertise I had built over years as an accountant led me to a position at a larger firm in Lagos, a fresh start in a city where nobody knew my history, where I wasn't the woman whose husband married her best friend. I threw myself into my work initially, using the structure and logic of numbers to make sense of a world that had shown me how illogical human hearts could be. About 18 months after my divorce was finalized, I met a man named Kingsley at a professional conference, a quiet, thoughtful man who worked in real estate development. Our relationship began slowly, cautiously, both of us carrying our own histories of betrayal. He had been through a difficult divorce of his own, a marriage that ended after his ex-wife's infidelity came to light. We understood each other in a way that felt rare. Two people who had learned the hard way that trust must be rebuilt slowly, deliberately, with full awareness of how fragile it can be. We married last year in a small ceremony that included only the people who had truly stood by me through my darkest moments: my parents, a handful of close colleagues, and new friends I had made in Lagos who knew my history but chose to love me anyway. It wasn't like my first wedding in its scale or grandeur, but it held something far more valuable: honesty. Every person in that room had earned their place there through genuine care, not convenience or obligation. I am pregnant now, 4 months along, and every day I feel a mixture of joy and cautious hope that I didn't think I would ever feel again after losing my first pregnancy under such painful circumstances. Kingsley treats this pregnancy with a tenderness that sometimes brings me to tears, understanding without me having to explain in detail why certain moments feel so significant, why I sometimes need reassurance that feels excessive to anyone who doesn't know my history. I share all of this with you, not simply to close out a dramatic story with a neat, happy ending, though I understand the appeal of that kind of resolution. I share it because I want you to understand something important. Betrayal, even the deepest, most devastating kind, does not have to be the final chapter of your story. It can be a painful chapter, certainly. It can reshape you in ways you never expected, force you to confront truths about people you trusted completely. But it does not have to define everything that comes after. I think often about that moment in the church, walking toward my ex-husband and my former best friend on their wedding day, choosing to speak words of forgiveness rather than words of anger or accusation. People have asked me since then how I found the strength to do that, how I managed to walk into a room full of people who expected me to fall apart and instead walk out having reclaimed some sense of power over my own story. The truth is, forgiveness in that moment wasn't really about them at all. It was about me refusing to let their choices continue to control my emotional landscape. Holding on to anger, as satisfying as it might feel in the moment, is ultimately a burden the angry person carries, often long after the person who caused the harm has moved on with their lives, seemingly unbothered by the wreckage they left behind. I refuse to carry that weight any longer. I refuse to let their betrayal become the defining story of my life when I had so much more living left to do.
Ngozi reached out to me once, about a year after the wedding, sending a long message apologizing again, asking if there was any possibility of rebuilding our friendship someday. I read her message several times before responding. I told her that I had forgiven her genuinely, but that forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. I told her that some doors once closed are meant to stay closed, not out of lingering bitterness, but of respect for the boundaries that protect our peace. She understood, or at least she said she did, and we haven't spoken since. Kanayo and I have had no contact beyond the necessary legal communications required during our divorce proceedings. I heard, through the grapevine, that still occasionally reaches me even in Lagos, that their marriage continues, though friends who know both families describe it as more of a quiet arrangement than a genuine partnership. Two people bound together by history and circumstance, rather than the deep, unshakable love that perhaps justified in their minds everything they destroyed to be together. I don't know how their story will ultimately end. I don't know if guilt will eventually erode whatever foundation they built, or if time will somehow heal the wounds that started their relationship in such painful circumstances. That story is no longer mine to tell, no longer mine to worry about. I have my own story now, one filled with genuine love, hard-won trust, and a future I am building with intention and clear eyes. If there is one thing I want you to take from this story, it is this. Pay attention to the people around you, even the ones you trust most completely. Betrayal often comes disguised as kindness, as comfort, as friendship that seems too good to question. But also know this, surviving betrayal, even devastating betrayal, does not mean your life is over. It means a chapter has closed, painfully, unexpectedly, but a new chapter is always waiting to begin if you have the courage to walk into it with your head held high. I walked out of that church 2 years ago, believing I was walking away from everything I had built, everything I had trusted. Looking back now, I understand I was actually walking towards something far better, a life built on honesty, on genuine love, on the hard-earned wisdom of knowing exactly what I deserve and refusing to accept anything less, ever again. If this story touched you, if it made you feel something, whether it was anger on my behalf or hope for what came after, please subscribe and share it with someone who might need to hear that betrayal, no matter how deep, does not have the final say in your story. Your strength does, your resilience does, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away with your head held high, choosing yourself, choosing your peace, choosing the beautiful life that is still waiting for you on the other side of your pain. Thank you for staying till the end, and I will see you in the next story.